Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and in the 2013 Pew Research Center study of American Jewry entitled A Portrait of Jewish Americans, one finding was that a majority of those Jews surveyed believed that in the efforts to create a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to implement a two-state solution, a majority of those American Jews surveyed by Pew believe the government of Israel is not making a sincere enough effort to bring about a peace settlement. Only 38% of those Jews surveyed by Pew feel that the Israeli government is doing enough for peace. Only among those Jews identifying themselves as Orthodox and conservative Jews was there a majority that feel that Israeli government is doing enough for peace. By the way, however American Jews feel about Israeli efforts to secure peace, there's a far less flattering view of Palestinian leadership. Among the Jews surveyed by Pew, only 12% of American Jewry believe that Palestinian leadership is making a sincere effort at peace with Israel. But regardless of how American Jews are critical of Palestinian leadership, it is striking that only 38% of American Jews believe Israel is sincere in its efforts to make peace. And this finding reflects a larger challenge facing the state of Israel in the public relations arena, in the media. And Israel is constantly being battered by a concerted, organized movement known as BDS, which stands for Boycotts of Israel, Divestments of Investments in Israel, and the attempt to impose sanctions on Israel. Boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, and every one of you needs to be familiar with the term BDS, because they're the weapons of choice now against the very legitimacy of the state of Israel. And on some very troubling level, these anti-Israel efforts are making inroads in the United States after being staggeringly successful in Europe. And there are many good, well-meaning Jews and non-Jews whose opinions of Israel and attitudes about Israel are being swayed in what may honestly be called a seductive campaign of anti-Semitic demagoguery. And among those individuals on the American scene who are engaged in combating the false and inaccurate portrayal of Israel is a man I'm honored to be sitting with now. Joseph Puder, founder and executive director of ITAI, the Interfaith Taskforce for America and Israel. Let me tell you a little bit about Joseph Puder. Joseph is a Sabra born in Israel. He served in the IDF as an Air Force flight engineer and then came to the United States to study. He obtained the graduate degree from Columbia's School of International Affairs and has a master's from Seton Hall University in Judeo-Christian Studies. And at the end of the 1980s, Joe served as the executive director and national director for Americans for a Safe Israel, and then worked for the American Jewish Congress in Philadelphia before founding the Interfaith Taskforce for America and Israel. And Joseph Puder, it's such a pleasure having you at this table. Thank you for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine.
I want to begin by asking you how you started the Interfaith Taskforce for America and Israel. What is it? What do you do there?
Well, for years I've been working with various mostly evangelical Christians who are extremely committed to Israel. There used to be, and still, I believe still is, a movement of evangelical Christians who do the prayer breakfast. And that is a sight to behold. I mean, if you're a Jew, you have these thousands of Christians who come at the end of what is the National Broadcasters Convention, Christian broadcasters. And they assemble with banners, the 12 tribes of Israel, and they parade in with Israeli flags, and the whole thing is biblical in proportion.
Wow.
And,
where is this taking
This is
place?
in Washington.
In Washington, D.C.
And for years I've gone to that, and I've made tremendous friendships established with many of these leaders, and it prompted me to realize that we have friends in the Christian community, but we also have those who are not exactly friendly, and those are the non-evangelical, the mainline Protestant denominations. And I realized that we need to target those. Now, it's interesting that the Reform movement, and to a certain extent the conservative movement, works very closely with the
Evangelicals.
No, not with the evangelicals, with the mainline Protestants
okay.
on social justice issues.
Yes.
Not on Israel. Israel, they agree to disagree, so let's just be friends and break bread and all of that, as long as we don't touch Israel. The conservative, or shall we say politically conservative Jews, tend to find a rapport with the evangelicals, primarily on the Israel issue. That's the linkage.
Interesting. Have you worked, by the way, with Yechiel Eckstein?
I know Yechiel very well. I didn't work with him closely, but Yechiel has his niche within the evangelical movement. The target, as far as I'm concerned, are the non-evangelical mainline Protestants. Mm-hmm. They are the old churches, the well-established churches from whom many of the presidents of the United States came from. And these are the churches that have a great deal of influence, a great deal of money, but they're also the churches that are tied to the World Council of Churches.
Joseph, explain to our audience, why is it that major Episcopal, major Methodist Christian organizations have been this close and sometimes crossed the line to joining the BDS movement, and they in some way are ready to impose boycotts on the state of Israel? How is that possible that the Christian community and that mainline Protestant organizations of a national nature have seemed to be so ready to criticize Israel?
Well, it's simple. They have long given up on the biblical prophecy as a way to reach God and be doing good for mankind. So the next best thing they felt was to do social justice. In doing social justice, they understand that white capitalistic societies, of European origin, have sinned somewhat towards the third world. There was a certain degree of guilt that the West feels, especially towards the third world. And the exponent of that third world are the Palestinians. And so they take up the mantle of social justice, and their victim de jour are the Palestinians.
Okay, this is so important as you describe it. Are they bad people?
No, they're not necessarily bad people. I'm sure they feel morally upright. The problem is that they're misguided.
They're misguided people.
The problem is that they don't see, or for that matter, they don't care about facts. You know, Fern loves to say, my friend Fern was here.
Fern Hassan is here.
Yeah. She loves to say, my mind is made up, don't confuse me with the facts. And that's precisely what happens with both a lot of these activists in these denominations, which includes Lutherans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and the United Church of Christ and the United Methodist Church. They really don't want to be confused by facts. They want to feel good. They want to feel upright morally. And to side with the Palestinians is one way of doing it.
But you heard my introduction. It's not just well-meaning Christians. There are many Jews who have the same motivation. it's not that they come here with any hatred of Israel or hatred of Jews per se, but they have this misguided sense of what justice means. And it looks as if Israel is the bad guy in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I asked you a moment ago, how did you come to found the interfaith work that you do? The Interfaith Council, is it?
The Interfaith Taskforce.
Task Force on America and Israel. What are you seeking to do with that Interfaith Task Force?
Well, let me tell you a little bit of history there. I connected with Presbyterian Church USA pastor, a very prominent pastor by the name of Bill Harder, Reverend Dr. Bill Harder. He did his postdoctorate in Jerusalem, fell in love with Israel, lived there, and understood the facts, and understood the Arab-Israeli conflict, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And he understood that what is being done is injustice to Israel. And so when I approached him, he was more than happy to work with me and basically spread the word out to other mainline Protestant churches. So our focus has been on reaching the mainline Protestant clergy as well as the churchgoers.
How do you do that?
Well, we essentially, through the word of mouth mostly, we don't advertise or anything. And I have a number of clergymen from the various denominations that are with us, that believe in Israel. You might even say that they are inclined Zionistically. And they approach other churches and basically suggest that that they do a program.
Do you speak?
Yes.
You go from place to place speaking?
We speak, and I do not only speak by myself, which I do occasionally. I have a team of sometimes people like Bill Harder, if it's appropriate. More often these days, I have, and I'm going to talk past tense because it happened yesterday and the day before yesterday. What I do is I bring my Middle Eastern team, which includes both Christian and Muslims from a whole range of Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, etc., and Lebanon.
How did you find the Muslims?
Well, the Muslims that I have happen to be educated ones that realize that today's Wahhabi brand of Islam, the extremism, the over-the-top kind of thing that has been exhibited by Islam in recent decades is far too dangerous, not only to fellow Muslims, but to humanity.
But I don't know how you found them. I
Well,
know they
I
are,
found
but
them.
how did you find them?
It's a good question. You know, you meet him at a congressional meeting, you meet him, for instance, I met Joe Hakim, who's a Lebanese Christian. I met him in Washington at a congressional hearing.
What's he do for a living, or what's his profession?
Well, he is actually an importer-exporter.
Okay, so he's not an academician.
No, but Dr. Ali, I'm trying to think about his last name.
It's okay.
Eliami, I just got it. Eliami has an organization, he's an academic, he has an organization in Washington which essentially targets the royal family in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. He's a Sunni Muslim, of course, but he understands that Israel is a model for humanity and human rights, and that religious freedom is one of the things that you don't have in Saudi Arabia, which you have in Israel.
So if you go into a church or into a Christian context, a Christian meeting, what's the essential message that you try to convey, you and those whom you bring with you?
That eventually, the ultimate message is that if you scan across the Middle East, you find that Israel is the only democracy and the only model for the kind of society that deep in their hearts most Arabs seek to have. They want to have the kind of open society Israel is. They want to have the religious freedom that Israel has, or Israelis have. They want to have the human rights that Israeli individual citizens have, that they don't have.
And
All of these attributes are something that they may hate Israel for its success, but it's a combination of envy and admiration.
Okay. And do you find, Joseph, that the people whom you are addressing in these Christian groups don't know this about Israel?
I find that they don't want to know.
Don't want to know?
Now, I think that it's easily accessible. I mean, the fact that Israel is an open democracy allows them to come and visit and see with their own eyes. They can see what Israel is. And in fact, those who have come to Israel, unless they come already with a prejudice, they will find Israel an open society. It strikes you right as you get off the plane. It's open. You can do what you want. You can say what you want. And you can pray in any way you want. So, no, you got to be blind not to recognize that upon arriving there and upon basically intermingling with the locals.
So I'm not quite clear. If they don't want to hear this, how do you get through to them when you speak to them? And again, part of what I have found is very often the people I speak to don't know. They're surprised to learn the truth about Israel. And they have been given, I used the word seduced before, that's what I feel happens. Good people are seduced by those who don't tell the whole story, who basically distort the truth, and good people who want to protect other people who are, from their perspective, being in some way abused. The next thing you know, they're critical of Israel. But if you're talking to people who don't want to know the truth, Joseph, how do you get through to them?
Well, that's part of it. Those that those that really genuinely do not know, or don't have enough facts, or have been told the wrong facts. But I would say that a pastor who reads newspapers, watches TV, and reads books. I mean, and we are flooded with information daily. If one wants to know, there's the internet. They can find out. There is no excuse for ignorance. So I would say that I'm almost ready to say they all should know if they don't know. But assuming that some do not know, I think what motivates them is that they want to do the right thing. They want to be decent people. And today, our media, academia is dominated by a culture that has been basically conquered, occupied, taken over by the left. And the left has projected a certain degree of guilt on particularly white middle class and upper class Americans. I mean, the lower classes struggle for survival. They don't have time for that stuff. But middle class and upper class do have the time. They read more, and they want to feel righteous. They want to justify their good life. And so, they are being told by academicians, if it's a young 25-year-old just came out of college, he feels that we must have robbed the third world to become rich. We must have done something wrong. How can we be such a rich society and look at the rest of the world? So there is this degree of guilt. And there was a book by Pascal Bruckner, who's a French philosopher and essayist, who actually addresses that. And he basically makes a collective statement about the Western world today. And guilt plays a humongous degree.
By the way, it's not that there aren't things for the West to be guilty about. While there is much, much more to America and much, much more to Israel, and by the way, Israel does not fall, I shouldn't even use the word Israel. While there's much about America that is just stunningly wonderful, it's not that in the history of early American life down to the present, there haven't been times when America has abused its power and has in some way taken advantage of third world situations to build up its own wealth. It's not as if America is guiltless, The issue is that guilt, A, all pervasive, and number two, why does it spill onto Israel? When Joseph, we see Israel as one of the first societies present anytime there's a crisis in the third world, anytime there's a crisis in Africa, and the extent to which Israelis are involved in helping to develop African towns, villages, and cities and society. Again, talk about stunning. Most American Jews don't have any sense of the extent to which one of the main efforts that comes out of the state of Israel is reaching out a hand in so many ways to help the underprivileged in the third world. And every now and then we see on CNN, on NBC, that when there is, a tsunami or when there's a flood or when there's an earthquake, lo and behold, the first medical team there is the state of Israel, and they're there first, and they stay there. And so every now and then there's a taste on the American media, in the American media, of the extraordinary work that Israel is doing. But by and large, American Jews and Americans in general have no clue of the extent to which Israel, if anything, must be applauded for the way it is reaching out to the third world.
I had lunch last night, not last night, afternoon, with an African-American pastor. And I told him about Golda Meir and Africa. Golda Meir made her foreign policy as foreign minister to basically altruistically help Africans, share with them what we have gone through and we achieved as a society. And this was not the way the Soviet Union did it, who had a real reason to penetrate Africa, or the West that wanted its share of influence. Israel did it for the right reason, for altruistic reasons, to help fellow human beings that have been oppressed to find a way towards a better world. We helped them with agriculture, we helped them with organization, we helped them to build their defenses, military defense. And it was done in a way that it wasn't about profit. It wasn't selling weapons or anything like that. This was forgotten by the African states in '73 when they cut off relations with Israel, but that's another story. What I want to address is the fact that the Jews, American Jews, also don't remember all of that. Well, it has to do with the same phenomenon. I mean, you come out of college these days, and as a 22, 23, you come out with a deep sense of impropriety about our society. And let me ask you, do you find any society, be it in the third world or in the first world, that hasn't got blemishes on its record?
Of course.
So it's not that America is perfect.
Of course.
But neither is France, and neither is Britain, and neither is any country in Europe
I'll say it again.
or in the third world.
You're exactly right. And what America has done for the benefit of others is extraordinary.
And that is the point. And therefore, neither Israelis, for sure, and certainly not Americans, should feel guilty. That is not what should motivate us. And I have pointed out in my article, a recent article that I did, that guilt is something that does not create productive relationships. And this is one of the problems we have in our society. Guilt is not looking objectively at race relations or in any kind of relationship.
What you're saying is so important, Joseph, and I just want to extend it one more moment and then have you react to it. I want to say it again. I think America is extraordinary. It's not, as you say, that America has not made mistakes, and there have been times when America has absolutely abused its power and has even raped other societies for its own benefit. I don't see any way to extend whatever criticisms we may have of America to Israel. And yet at the moment, one of the main criticisms of Israel is that it's a colonial power, and that the issues going on the West Bank are really a throwback to the late 19th century, early 20th century, when colonialism was driving many nations from Great Britain and then France and Spain and later on America, but that Israel's quarrel with the Palestinians and Israeli presence on the West Bank, occupation, is not a function of Israeli colonialism. It's a function of Israeli security, and that the majority of Israelis would be ready to enter a two-state peaceful solution with the Palestinians if they believed it was honest, and that the Palestinians were willing to live side by side. As we're meeting right now, by the way, people will be seeing this repeated. I mean, having you on is fabulous for me, and I want people to see this over and over again. But as we're sitting at this table right now, we just commemorated the memorial service for Ariel Sharon. And Ariel Sharon, while early in his career, with Menachem Begin, tried to implement a Jewish population move onto the West Bank. Later in life did a 180, and Ariel Sharon was the one who said, we're disengaging from Gaza, we're going to take down Gush Katif, we're going to move all of the Israeli settlers in Gaza out of Gaza, and we're going to give it to the Palestinians. And the idea was that they would leave these beautiful greenhouses and kibbutzim of sorts and settlements that the Palestinian people could then use to thrive and to move forward. Instead, we got 8,000 Katyusha rockets falling on Sderot,
right.
Ashdod. There was an attempt to even hit cities further north. And there was a reign of terror, which the West, the United Nations, the European nations, and America permitted to go on for years until Israel finally put a stop to it. There is not inherent in the Israeli system, is what I'm trying to say over and over on Shalom TV. It's not a colonial situation. And I want you to comment from your perspective the extent to which, you may think I'm overstating it or not. I want to know the extent to how you would answer those who would say to you, listen, Joseph Puder, isn't Israel guilty of colonial activity on the West Bank?
First of all, Israel was created in 1948 in the post-colonial age already. In fact, we got our independence practically at the same time as India did. Two colonial areas where Britain ruled. So that's, again, a colonial power usually has a home base. Where's the Jewish home base? In America, no. There are Jews also in Russia. And at that time, there were as many Jews almost in Russia as in the United States. So the charge of colonialism is sheer malice, sheer invention, sheer evil. In fact, if anything, Israel has done more for the decolonized Africans and Asians than any other country. And there was a sense of solidarity in the Third World with Israel in the early years. I think that what happens, if I look objectively at history, what happens is that the charge of colonialism really becomes valid, quote unquote, after the Six-Day War. All of a sudden, Israel is a colonizer.
It became legitimate.
Legitimate. I don't think that the charge of a colonial power, with the exception of a few Arab leaders, I don't think that the charge of colonialism.
You're absolutely right. It's a post-67 charge.
Right. And one has to understand, number one, again, we will deal with facts and history. The Gaza Strip and the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, were taken from an illegitimate entity that occupied it in 1948. The Arab Legion, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and its Arab Legion occupied the West Bank. Only two countries recognized that, Pakistan and Britain. The rest of the world did not. And it was really never a legitimate kind of thing. Abdullah wanted to extend his kingdom. The Egyptian wanted to have something from the 48 war, and King Farouk could claim he did something. So they kept Gaza. It was an infestation. They hated it. I mean, it was a chaos reigned all throughout. It was a hotbed for fedayeen. 67, Israel took it in a defensive war. And you might recall, and I'm hoping that the audience will recall, that Nasser closed the Strait of Tiran, which is a cause belli for any kind of country to react. And Israel had legitimate right to react. But before it reacted, Abba Eban went to Washington, to London, to Paris, and he pleaded, get the closures open. Open the Straits of Tiran and remove the forces that, the United Nations forces that were removed, and Egyptian
Nasser
forces.
removed the UN forces that were guarding
and there were
the Straits of
then
Tiran.
that the positions were occupied by Egyptians.
Correct.
This had to be removed because it was against the 57 agreement. So the fact is that Nasser did not remove the
Egyptian troops.
The Egyptian troops. The Straits of Tiran were closed to Israeli navigation, and this was a darn good reason for Israel reacting. And that war, and certainly Jordan, of all people, I was in a base, received initially, already on June 5th, bombs.
67.
67. That fell
Where were you?
meters.
Where were you?
I was my air base in Tel Nof.
Tel Nof.
Yes.
I've been there.
Yes, and the bombs fell. And they didn't do a great deal of damage.
On June 5th they fell?
On June 5th. And
Because Israel pleaded
that's right.
with Jordan.
King Hussein.
Right, with King Hussein, not to enter that
Correct.
war.
Correct. And he was persuaded, you know, the inner Arab relations are very interesting because King Hussein was subjected to, in time after time, attempted assassinations, which were inspired by Nasser, and he felt terribly intimidated. And when Nasser called, he responded. Had he not responded, I'm sure that Nasser would have found a way to try again to assassinate him. The deal was, you work with us now, you cooperate, we'll let you keep your kingdom in peace. It's an Arab promise to a fellow Arab.
It's very important.
Not always kept, but
yes, it's
promise.
very important for the audience to understand what really happened historically in 67, because very often when I see a piece in the New York Times or I see a piece on ABC or CNN, it sounds as if Israel won a piece of territory in an act of aggression. There is no context given that provides the reader or the viewer of television to understand that Israel was reacting in a defensive war, and it was only when Jordan attacked Israel that Israel moved onto the West Bank, liberated the city of Jerusalem, and ultimately wound up in control of the West Bank. And Joseph, I remember, you know, words are so important. I remember how during that era, everybody talked about the liberation of Jerusalem and the liberation of the West Bank. It was liberated from illegitimate Jordanian control, during which time there was no Palestinian move to create a Palestinian state on the West Bank. And when the PLO was created in 1964, 63, 64, the liberation they were talking about was Tel Aviv and Haifa.
That's correct.
It had nothing to do with the West Bank.
That's right.
And in essence, that's what the Jewish state has been facing from 1948 to the day as we sit here together.
That's correct.
And that's hardly a colonial enterprise.
But facts again, we covered Egypt and we covered Jordan. There's also Syria. And Syria provoked tensions even before the 67 war.
Absolutely right.
When they tried to divert the water, the
Jordan River.
the source of the Jordan River. And that would have basically created a terrible catastrophe to Israeli agriculture, and for that matter, for drinking water to average Israelis. I mean, this was a critical thing. People forget that it's water, not oil, that in that region of the world is the most critical.
Yes.
So Syria is continuously provoking was provoking
Yes.
Israel.
They were also shelling the Hula
And
Valley.
shelling, exactly.
From the Golan
on the
Heights.
kibbutzim on En Gev.
Exactly right. And you had Egypt and Syria amass an extraordinary amount of troop movement and tanks. And Nasser was saying, is a countdown to when we're going to sweep in and push every Israeli into the sea.
Well, we remember very well the radio broadcasts of the Voice of the Arabs, and Nasser's shouting and promising the Arab masses that we will bring justice, we will throw the Jews into the sea.
Okay, now here's your problem.
And this is something that people forget.
That's
the
your
retention
problem.
factor.
Your problem is people don't know, but it's worse, Joseph. They say it doesn't matter. Nobody wants to go back in history.
Oh, I
it's
know.
almost as if, well, if we go back in history, who's to say how far do you go back? I don't want to talk about history, I'm told. I just want to know what's happening now. And right now, Israel has been in control of that West Bank since 1967 and is occupying another people's land, which, by the way, is wrong. But is certainly in control of another population, and that is true.
Well, not quite. Today,
We are in control.
97%.
We're in control. We determine what happens in a larger sense of what Palestinian life is on the West Bank.
Let me respond to that, please.
Okay.
Number one, you have, according to the Oslo Accord, there's area A, B, and C.
Correct. 3 distinct areas.
Exactly.
On the West
Area
Bank.
A and B, especially Area A, is totally controlled by the Palestinians.
That is correct.
And they run their cities, they run their villages surrounding the cities. They have total control. Israel has no drissat regel, as we say.
It's not there on the ground.
On the ground.
Right.
Now, Area C is under Israeli control. And in Area C, there's only about, give or take, 50,000 Palestinians living. So the bulk of the Palestinian population is in Area A and C, so how can we possibly control them? But let me go a step back.
No, I don't want you to go a step back yet.
Okay.
There will be viewers who will feel you're being insensitive. And that while you are correct, and I hope everybody understands what you're saying, in certain areas of the West Bank, there is a total autonomy of life. You have Palestinian police, government, hospitals, social services, education, and life. At the same time, there is an overarching presence of the State of Israel on the West Bank.
I want to correct something. I'm certainly as sensitive as a human being towards fellow human beings. And what is the so-called controlling part is checkpoints. This is what really the detractors of Israel would tell you, checkpoints. But
does Israel have the right to go into a community in the land designated as Section A, if it feels its security is at risk?
Yes.
Okay, that's the way in which the Palestinians are still under, in some way, Israeli control. Israel does not have the right to cross an international border unless it's an act of war. It has the right to cross into any land on the West Bank if Israel believes a security issue is at stake. Now, I understand what you're saying, and it's important for our audience to understand that if you lived in certain cities on the West Bank as a Palestinian, you'd never see an Israeli soldier. But in the larger sense, Israel absolutely controls every inch of the West Bank. And from my perspective, it's for a reason that we're there. And I'll say it again, if there was a real Palestinian leadership that would make peace with the State of Israel, that presence would be gone. And I say to anybody who takes a far-left position critical of Israel, what do you want Israel to do? And whenever I hear an American Jew especially a liberal Jew, talk to me about the Jewish values they want Israel to, in some way, embody, my first thing I say to them is, the most important Jewish value is pikuach nefesh.
Yeah, that's right.
You are forbidden to commit suicide. And as long as Israel has a threat facing them, the first value that I want Israel to uphold, Jewish value, is we do not commit suicide. We have a responsibility to pikuach nefesh for ourselves. And there's a very famous line that you well know, but I want our audience to hear it. There's a Talmudic principle. The reason you may never commit suicide is you may never say somebody else's blood is redder than yours. Nobody else's blood is redder than yours, which means nobody's life who's not Jewish has more of a value than your life. Now, the Jew can't say my blood is redder than yours. My blood is not redder than yours. But when it comes to committing suicide, you may never say the other person's life has more value than mine.
Correct.
No, we must work out in this world how we live together, understanding that both of us have a dignity. And what I don't hear from those on the far left is the dignity of the Jew. I only hear about how Israel is in somehow...
But there is something else, Mark. In the 1950s, we used to cross to Gaza, going after the Fedayins. Now, the same Fedayins are today the Fatah and Hamas terrorists. So Israel has full justification. If we had to do that with Gaza, we certainly can do that much closer to home, where it's really sometimes a stone throw away. But I think we must go back to something else, and that is to Resolution 242 of the UN Security Council. And that is something that has to be understood in the right context. When that resolution was passed, first of all, it talked about territories, not all of the territories.
Okay, let's just make sure our audience knows. 242 was passed after the Six-Day War.
That's correct. Now, it also provided that the territories would be exchanged for peace, a peace that neither the Arab world nor the Palestinians have ever been willing to give Israel. We have right now, as we speak, this question of recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. The Arab world hasn't yet recognized that, and neither have the Palestinians. And that is a fundamental issue. Not that we need to. Begin never really cared much if they recognize us or not.
Right. Yeah, Pete says right now it doesn't matter whether they ever call us a Jewish state or not.
Right. But there's a principle there. It's acceptance. I mean, you can call it recognize Israel as a Jewish state or acceptance of Israel as such, as for whatever it is. And that is lacking. And that is really what people don't understand. The Israeli public, the Israeli voters, have chosen a right-of-center government for a reason. Prior years, during the Oslo period in the 90s, they voted largely. A huge majority was for peace and concessions. And then came the year 2000. July 2000, when Ehud Barak was there with Clinton and with Arafat at Camp David. And, I'll give you 95% of the West Bank and Gaza. I'll give you a presence in Jerusalem. We'll make whatever we can. The United States will help economically. Let's end the conflict here and now. And this has been an issue that is overriding, and it's still going to be an overriding issue in the coming weeks and months and years. This is, I think, at the crux of the problem. Recognition that there has to be an end. Finish. We now have you don't owe me, I don't owe you. Let's begin a relationship, a clear and open and fair and just relationship. And that is the element that's lacking. The Arab world and the Palestinians in particular have this sense that they have been robbed.
They feel they have been robbed,
right.
Joseph.
And this is something that you cannot...
Have they been robbed?
Well, I think it was... No, they weren't been robbed, if anything, by their leaders. You know, I think it was Shimon Peres who said, You cannot bring the cemetery to the maternity ward. In other words, they rejected independence in 47. They had an opportunity which the Kurds didn't have, which a lot of other peoples did not have, to assert their independence. They refused to do that because their game was all or nothing at all.
That's correct.
And they've paid a price. And nations do pay a price for that.
The world is not willing to impose the price upon them.
Well, and neither is Israel. And that's the beauty of it. This is the humanity of Israel. I mean, I'm an Israeli, and I can tell you that I would love to have a true relationship with a fellow state, call it Palestine, call it whatever you want.
Boy, I hope everybody hears you. You're an Israeli. Do you hate Palestinians?
No, absolutely not.
But I
hate the killers.
I understand. I almost never meet an Israeli who doesn't say the exact same thing. I don't hate Palestinians at all. You're willing to have a second state, a Palestinian state on the West Bank?
I'm willing to see a peaceful Palestinian state.
Peaceful.
Absolutely.
If I said to you it was a real, honest peace, do you have any problem with that?
No.
Do you believe it's possible?
Eventually, hopefully,
Okay,
yes.
Is it possible now
No.
with the current leadership in the Palestinian
I don't
world?
think so, no. First of all, these so-called leaders are extremely corrupt. They have lined up their pockets. They have basically instituted a kind of regimes that both Arafat and Abu Mazen, and of course I'm not talking about Hamas at all, which is essentially gangsterism. It's mafia-like. I mean, huge amounts of money coming from the West. Nobody controls, nobody cares. It's used for the wrong things, put in the wrong places, and it is corrupting the people. And the people are, the Palestinian people I feel sorry for.
Okay, I want to come back to something you've said because it has become more and more controversial as we're speaking because of a recent book by Ari Shavit. And in Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land, one of the things he argues is that it wasn't white and black during the War of 48, and that there were, tragically, times when Israelis pushed Arabs, they weren't called Palestinians in 48, they pushed Arabs out of what was going to become de facto the State of Israel in 1948 because they believed that certain areas of Israel had to have a Jewish majority. And therefore, I want you to be sophisticated as you can be when I say to you, did Israel ever rob a Palestinian of land?
Well, there were...
The answer is yes.
There were injustices,
Yes. It's
yes.
called life.
That's right.
There is no place on earth where injustice doesn't happen.
Oh, absolutely.
There were some
individual
injustices.
cases.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
The
But
question,
as a policy,
as policy, it didn't exist.
That's right.
Really. And number two, does it delegitimize the State of Israel?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. By the way, that to me is what has to be hammered home. There were excesses, there were abuses, there were tragedies. The truth is that in the vast overview of the 48 war, Israel was magnificent. What Israel has tried to do is magnificent. The extent to which the Israeli Arab has, not only in theory, but in practice, a certain degree of equality that Arabs don't have in their own world, that the African American community in this country suffered without any of the rights that Arab Israelis had from day one. Yes, it's not a perfect system, but when you view it against any other place in the world, Israel is the model of what we're striving for. And the question for me is always, what are you emphasizing? The yet to be perfected real world? Or are you looking at the extent to which the State of Israel has created a society where the Arab Israeli and the Palestinian, by the way, the Palestinian who comes across into Israel for medical treatment is treated in every single Israeli hospital the exact same way in Israel. We take care of terrorists who are injured in acts that hurt Israel. Or it's just extraordinary to me.
Right.
And what I don't see enough is this being hammered home And one of the things I wanted to ask you, as somebody who does this, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a magnificent way, Joseph, how's Israel, by the way, doing in what's called the Hasbara war? How are we doing in the media here in America or in Europe, around the world? How do you feel we're doing in terms of the PR battle?
I did a piece on that. We're doing poorly, very poorly.
Why?
Well, until 67, we didn't need Hasbara. I mean, we were the David that
That's
was,
correct. We were the David to their Goliath.
People for some reason looked at the map more often in those days, and they saw a little Pitzkala Jewish state surrounded by these huge Arab states. But all of a sudden, after 67, Israel became a giant for some reason. So we became the Goliath instead of the David that we were.
Is it true?
No.
Are we the David? Are we the Goliath now?
Well, we are to a certain level.
We are not.
Well,
no, I want to make this
let
clear.
me be honest.
Israel is not. Israel
not
is
Goliath,
a David with a very powerful slingshot. That's all.
Exactly.
He's still David.
I think you said it right.
And that's what should be said over and over again. Don't get it wrong. We are still David. We have a good slingshot. That's all.
That's a good metaphor.
Isn't it?
I like that.
All right. And if the Arab world ever figured that out, if they one day had a better slingshot, we'd be in huge trouble. We are still the David. And it's a media distortion
But it's
to
also a
portray
question
us as the Goliath.
I mean, if you look at the maps today, just as yesterday,
We're surrounded.
we are still got
We are
the same.
nobody.
You still have 5 million plus 5,184,000 square miles, which comprises the Arab world. We have 8,000 square miles of Israel and the West Bank. Now, what about proportionality here? That gives you a certain dimension. So no, I think that we are certainly stronger than we were in 48.
Of course.
We are certainly more sophisticated as a society.
Yes.
We got technology. We have
This little David is doing very, very well. That's all.
That's all.
But in terms of the Israeli-Arab, one of the genius things that was done by the Arab world is they changed the rhetoric. When it was the Israeli-Arab conflict, we were the David.
Right.
If it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it sounds like it's Israel against one small, embattled little group of Arabs. That's not what we have here.
But let me use a word that is very important in the lexicon: victimhood. Now, you see, the Palestinians have been made by the left in particular, both the European left and the American left, as the du jour victim. Now, no matter what Israel does, Israel is portrayed as the stronger, more intimidating force. And therefore, we got to sympathize with the underdog, which is the Palestinian now. That kind of shifts the focus on the reality on the ground. And when I talked about the inconveniences, or I mentioned the fact that Israel really doesn't have any infringement on the Palestinians. Yes, they do. I'll take it back. At the checkpoint, yeah, it's discomforting to have searches, delays. All of that is very discomforting. But look at the price if we didn't do that.
Of course.
We built a wall to prevent terrorism.
Of course.
It's pikuach nefesh again. It's lives.
Yes.
And this is something that we have to. You asked me earlier about what do I do when I come to a church. I'll tell you an interesting story that I did do. I was outside on Mount Gerizim, overlooking Nablus, and I took a photo, a panoramic photo, of the city. And this is a comment on where U.S. aid money goes to. On the left side, where I stood on the hills, you see the Golden Gate villas. I'm saying gate meaning doors, gold-plated, cranes all over on the hills, building fabulous homes for the Palestinian Authority officials. Then you look down very much at the bottom of the hill, and there are the refugee camps, and not a single crane is to be seen. And I asked my Methodist, United Methodist Church audience, do you see this? Where do you see the cranes? You said this side. Where do you see the refugees? This side. Do you see any cranes on the refugees? No. Well, there is nothing done for the real people that you people want so much to help. The money goes there. The refugees are still the refugees. Israel absorbed more refugees from the Arab world than the Palestinians ever had in terms of refugees. And they haven't been absorbed yet after 65 years. And that is something to be said.
Absolutely. You make a wonderful point. I want to squeeze one more question in.
Sure.
As we're meeting, it's in the aftermath of the ASA boycott, academic boycott of Israel. And after that, there was a MFA boycott of Israel, and MLA, the Modern Language Association boycott. I only want to know from your perspective, at the moment, do you feel that academic boycotts will become more prevalent in America? Or do you feel that these are just passing fads and that, in fact, so many academic institutions just creamed the ASA, just said it was the most horrific thing they'd ever seen, and that do you feel that basically America is still free of the kind of bigotry, it's a bigotry against Jews, that the boycott of the ASA and the MLA represent? Just give me 60 seconds on where you feel we are on that issue.
Well, I think that the attempts will continue because, to a large extent, the culture in America and throughout the West is now dominated by the left. The left has allied itself with the Muslims, politically in Europe, on campuses here in the United States. The attempts will be there. But I think there's also this force called the desire for academic freedom in America. And sophisticated academicians understand, and university presidents understand, the damage that boycotts could do. And besides which, Israel is a wonderful source of research and development. And I think many of the universities do not want in any way to cut their ties with Israel.
Joseph Puder, you do fabulous work, and I had a sheaf full of questions for you. We've only scratched the surface. Will you promise to come back and we'll continue the discussion?
We sure do.
Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. Thank you for being with me.
My pleasure.
Thank you for helping us understand the issue better.
I wish we had more time because there's so much more to say.
We'll just do this again.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very, very much. My conversation with Joseph Puder, who's the Executive Director of Interfaith Taskforce for America and Israel. As always, please be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the things Joseph had to say. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.